Hey everyone, great to be together to kick off this webinar on marine ecosystem credits. My name is Martin Weinstein. I'm the founder and executive director of the OpenEarth Foundation, and the OpenEarth Foundation launched its ocean program early in the year, and this is one of the first opportunities to showcase a bit of some of that work, and we'll walk through the concepts. I'll give a quick introduction of OpenEarth and how this program came to be, as well taking over from some of my colleagues. Maybe before I kick off, I'll pass over just for everyone to that's on the panel now to say quick words of who you are, what you work on at OpenEarth, and then I'll take it from there, start sharing my screen and kick us off. Maybe over to Luisa or Mao.
Hi, everybody. I'm Luisa, and I have a background in biodiversity systematics. I work at OpenEarth on our data and community, and I'm helping advise on the Oceans program. I'll pass it off to Mao.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Maureen Fonseca. I live in Costa Rica, and I am data engineer and project manager in the Ocean program. And my background is more in methodology, but I have a lot of experience with data analysis, and data quality, and also remote data. And I work into Ando.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Ando Shah. I'm a Climate Innovation Fellow at the OpenEarth Foundation. I'm an environmental data scientist. I work on the Ocean program and also other carbon and biodiversity-related projects at OpenEarth. I'm also a PhD student at UC Berkeley, and I'm excited to be here. I'll hand it off to Paige.
Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing good. My name is Paige Lewington. I work on the Oceans team. I am a marine scientist, and my background is in marine conservation. So I've recently joined the team, and I'm excited to be here.
Great. Thank you all. Let's kick off. I'll start sharing my screen and let me know if you can see it well. So in many ways, the title for today, which is Exploring Marine Ecosystem Credits, is pretty spot on, because this has been a very important exploration, and I'll give an introduction of how that exploration came to be, where we're at, and where we're going next. Before that, just to articulate some of the projects that we have in the innovation lab of OpenEarth, because we are a big picture planetary scale innovation lab. We work in the intersection of emerging technologies, open source, to think about what's the digital infrastructure that we need to augment human capacity to deal with planetary resilience. And that translates into different programs like our climate program, our oceans, our city and energy program, which each of those programs incubate specific projects. We recently launched a large platform of climate accounting for the Paris Agreement called Open Climate. You can see that webinar and the platform, access it on our website at openearth.org. Ocean, of course, is one of the key aspects that we're tackling today. Cities entails a big project that we have with the United Nations climate change. And so this is where we're going to dive in today. And of course, because we are essentially an R&D lab, we try to also think about what's cross-cutting across all these different domains, including mechanisms for decentralized finance, smart contracts, system modeling of social financial mechanisms in the context of environmental challenges, collaboration. We see collaboration as one of the most important technologies that we're still needing to master to be able to ensure that we maintain the planetary resilience, and the role of identity, who's who, and agents within digital networks. And again, the logic of making it digital infrastructure a public good. We're delighted to be a partners of UN climate change, and in fact, one of the things that we constantly look at oceans is how oceans play a critical and important role on climate, but vice versa also around biodiversity. So the story, that exploration, starts in February last year in a trip that we did with members of the Costa Rican government and organized by an NGO called FICO, Friends of Cocos Island. o amigos de la isla de Coco. The Coco Island is a single island outside the continental part of Costa Rica, but it's part of a underwater mountain range that connects to Galapagos. So all these amazing humans that are here were part of that expedition, essentially to discuss and understand the need to increase the marine park, which was legislated early this year and effectively grew the marine park 27 times. So after that trip, we understood that growing the size of a marine park, any protected park, has opportunities and also has tensions. How does a government deal with the budgeting of growing that area to ensure that it maintains the same level of integrity when you are dealing with a ocean area that's 27 times bigger? So out of that trip, I put together a couple of ideas and opportunities for innovation in the marine protected area. And I'm not going to go deep into these because this is still just the background of what led to where we're at today. But one of the first things that I looked at from the things that we've learned from the climate space is that the marine space has an opportunity to sort of leapfrog and to have a common digital architecture and networking protocol that can connect the different informations that are needed for agents such as in the bottom, sensors, databases, people, laws, AI features to constantly understand the context of where an event is happening within an MPA. And so that all of this sort of like logic or operating system logic can aid the process of monitoring and control strategy. So in many ways, we talk a lot about the need for creating a climate internet. This is sort of like a mechanism in which if you have a phone and you are inside an MPA, that phone understands the context and is able to pull up all the information just by its geopositioning. And in oceans, geopositioning is critical. So this was the first idea. The second one is around ways to automate process of monitoring and control, particularly the enforcement aspect. So if there's an infraction case where, let's say, an illegal or a fishing vessel is undertaking an illegal activity within an MPA, then collecting the evidence from satellite, understanding the history and reputation of that vessel, the patrol evidence, how does that trickle into automated processes for enforcement and penalty records? And the third part, because that was one of the areas that we understood that create high costs this way. And the third was the idea that we could find ways to mobilize more finance to MPAs by thinking about credits. Similar to carbon credits, but for oceans, where these can support financial mechanisms. For example, if we know that not protecting an MPA drives the business, the baseline of the ecosystem health down, the actions, the conservation actions can bring it up, and then there could be an outcome-based scheme. So just among the stakeholders that we have between government, between NGOs, this was one that took the most interest. So inspired by the initial journey and the importance of the Cocos Island globally, but more than anything, that what we had learned in this trip actually is relevant to all marine protected areas, particularly those in the global south, where governments have less capability to affront high budgets in protecting their ocean economic exclusive areas. We launched the program to particularly research deep down into what marine ecosystem credits could look like, what would be the methodologies, and how would one design them. So I'm going to go walk through the high level framework for their design. I'll talk briefly about the thoughts that we've had around what are the financial mechanisms and markets that these credits might enable governments to access. And then I'll hand it over to my colleague to talk a little bit more into the most important first credit, which is looking at a place like Cocos Island or the Galapagos biodiversity credit. So not just purely focusing on carbon, really understanding the integrity of the space and as a safe habitat for a myriad of species. So in many ways, think about the design that I'll talk about as a family of credits, or in fact, I'll use stack, which is a little bit more specific. So we are in an exciting time in a week away from COP15 in the negotiation of a global biodiversity framework. Among other things that are being discussed is the need to protect fully 30% of our oceans and land. That means that we need to figure out what are the financial mechanisms to do that. In the case of climate negotiations, this has been historically an issue. Who's going to pay for adaptation? Who's going to pay for mitigation? Who's going to pay for loss and damage? And it takes a while to think about these things. So it makes a lot of sense for us to sort of leapfrog and think about what are innovations and solutions to deal with a 30% conservation. And thinking about systems that are scalable, not just to, let's say, a Central American country, that are equitable, that do consider local stakeholders, that consider the international context, and that fundamentally are scientific. So one of the things that we identified also in an area such as cocos is that it's already pretty high integrity. It's high in health. And so increasing the size of the park requires that we need to maintain that level of protection. Now, that is a contrast between other places that have been significantly degraded, where the main primary actions there is restoration. So one of the first things that we wanted to distinguish as forms of credit and actions and conservation actions are those that deal with protecting what's there and those that deal with restoring. In some sense, in that conservation and action hierarchy, protection tries to avoid and minimize impact, whereas restoration already assumes or understands that impact already happened, so it needs to restore it. And that obviously impacts into understanding baselines, understanding business as usuals, understanding the type of actions that are needed in both sides. And then finally, we see at the bottom, offsetting. Offsetting is one of the things that we did not venture in. I think that there's a lot of reasons to think about mechanisms that don't use oceans as an offset for damages elsewhere, because we really need to start looking at the planet as a whole. There's no way where a zero-sum game works at the global level. And then the big distinction is also mechanisms of payments on conservation that reward efforts versus those that reward results. So just looking at a table of protection and restoration, and obviously these tables and these diagrams that I'm showing here, you now have access to them through the white paper that you can find. If you go to openearth.org and go to the ocean program, you'll be able to download the white paper and follow through. So the payment schemes, either through supporting the efforts, let's say if we are doing a restoration effort-based scheme, we are paying for the amount of kelp that we're planting, not whether that the restored kelp forest increased biodiversity. If we are supporting an outcome-based protection scheme, then we are financing that the outcome is that the baseline has been maintained, that it's high in health, and effectively is being protected. And so in the bottom, we see a different types of credit from, like, what does it look like for biodiversity, from eutrophication, which is in some sense a way to understand the level of pollution health, particularly as what nitrogen runoffs and nutrient runoff create in oceans, plastic credits and carbon credits. So to start thinking us as a framework setter for a sort of new sector, we laid out some principles that we think that credits need to maintain. And those are modularity, that credits need to be dynamic, that need to consider decentralization into the digital infrastructure and also the logics of the main stakeholders, that is really jumping into the full digitized space, and that they're open. And so I'll walk through to that. Normally, when we think about our traditional carbon credits, there's a concept called co-benefits. And a co-benefit in a carbon credit deals with the credit is a 1 ton of CO2, but it has the co-benefit that maybe it helps local communities or it's supporting biodiversity. For example, if we're looking at nature-based solutions of carbon credits, in forests. Those we see as you sort of partition them. What we wanted to see is a mechanism that allows to stack them so that each type of credit has its own methodology, and they stack on top of a common base unit, which we took as 1 square kilometer over 1 year. And so over that square kilometer over 1 year, we can see what is the biodiversity credit value, what's the plastic credit, being the value of removing plastic of oceans, create almost a library of credits, and then one can have a cohesive, holistic view of the area. Compartmentalize also makes it difficult to separate the methodologies and assign the different impacts of each one. So put it into further visualization. If we're looking at a sub-region in the light blue box, which would be our MPA, obviously this is within a bigger region, often a bioregion or a marine corridor inside Earth. That level of contextualization is key for everything we do at OpenEarth. And then those square kilometers over 1 year, the example, what the stackability and the modularity allows is that in some parts of a park, you can assign biodiversity credits. In others, for example, in a coastal region where there are a lot of plastic removal campaigns have been created, one can assign plastic credits. And also stacking, for example, an area in the top right where you get a plastic credit and a blue carbon credit, for example. So these are just conceptualizations of what we wanted to instill from the architecture. The second part is dynamic nature of these credits. And one of the things that why this is key, particularly as we start working on oceans, is that the scientific knowledge of for example, whether protecting an MPA increases carbon sequestration and trying to assign a carbon credit actually has high levels of uncertainty, because the oceans are one of the most complex areas to model and understand from our planet. They are constantly moving in all directions and have large amounts of dynamic variables. So what we thought was key is, rather than trying to figure out perfect scientific certainty before launching a type of credit or a assetized record, that there is a mechanism for understanding the level of uncertainty. And as we have more data from different sources, satellites and local sensors and better models, that level of uncertainty can be reduced. And then in here, uncertainty can be a modulating factor into the value of a credit. So in financial terms, this is very much like risk adjustment. A credit or a claim that has high uncertainty has high risk. So as we reduce risk, we reduce uncertainty, the credit might be worth more. And that can, again, affect the value. The third aspect is digital decentralization. And that applies to a couple of things. Digital entities that are involved, again, satellites, sensors, phones, verification agents, people, organizations that are part of verifying processes in a conservation area, data security, records of token and tokenization. So how do you mint or create that asset, and where do you keep a record of that, whether it's been traded, whether it's retired, whether it's just in a local inventory, and the separation of roles. And for separation of roles here, what we mean is, again, in the traditional carbon market space, there is an issuer of a credit. There is a practitioner that normally is the one that takes the conservation action and obviously receives the credit, is the holder of it. And then there's a verifier, a third-party entity that really ensures that what that practitioner is doing is effective and also can check that claim. So the aspect there is that to be able to properly verify things at scale, we really need to tap into all the new technologies that we have in digitization. And at the top right, we see the legend of all these different agents, which is that they all represent network digital agents. So when I talked a bit about that common language or architecture for oceans, is it to ensure that all these agents can speak a similar language and can have the right level of context, scientific measurements, operators, local stewards that are in the area, databases that are informing about biodiversity levels within the area, and of course, satellites or models of oceans, how all these are part of the same process. Openness relates to the value of making the architecture and the infrastructure to allow rollouts of credits and MPAs to be public goods. So there's a whole bunch of things that we talk about in the white paper about the level of openness. And in many ways, all of these sort of compile into this summary of the type of credits that we think are relevant to start designing and thinking, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's a protection or a restoration action, eutrophication, dealing with nutrients. Again, the first aspect is the modularity of them, the decentralization across the digital architecture, the MRV being fully digital, the dynamic or uncertainty nature, and again, obviously the contextualization of that MPA in the broader level. So here's a unified process of what we just walked through, the overarching framework. Then there's actions, and those actions lead to claims. That claim leads to a process of monitoring, reporting, and verification. We talk about an MRV pool so that local practitioners can have access to financial credit lines to do MRV to ensure that this is low cost. The use of models, particularly to independently verify claims, the factor of uncertainty, issuing credits, creating buffer pools that are often used also to a second level of risk management, pricing, and then using or selling. And we'll talk then next to once we have these credits, what are mechanisms and markets for them? And of course, this is one of the things that from the government side, particularly one of our collaborators, which has been the Costa Rican government, they said, this is great. What do we do with the credits once we have them? And so we've identified 3 avenues for them. One is applications in public and private philanthropic conservation. The second is on the use of multilateral markets or even national markets. And the third around a more novel process or frontier that we're exploring around nature-based currencies. So the first one, if we see the little squares as our credit framework for an MPA, this is essentially used as guarantee for whoever's providing philanthropic capital to the government or the local NGO that's conducting the conservation action, so that there is a proof that with the funding, those actions led to enhanced ecosystem health. It doesn't introduce a new mechanism, it just augments the existing one. The second one, more around very similar dynamic here, but the difference is that now those credits can be sold or traded, and now they sit within whoever bought them, and the funding are used for it. For many countries, this is not constitutionally viable. Costa Rica is one, Ecuador is another, and even though we have the opinion that this is probably not the best use of credit, it's still viable for countries that want to do it. Because even a third aspect where these credits or crediting system can be useful is in the context of nature for debt swaps. Particularly the countries in the global south tend to have large indebted accounts to global north. So a creditor can alleviate that debt by assuring that the debtor country uses a similar level of funding, but it can be done in a local weaker currency normally to conduct the conservation actions, ensuring that ecosystem health is protected. And then again, these credits can be used for transfers or guarantees. But the third and perhaps one most interesting aspects that we proposed is, what if these, they're not traded, they are assets, natural capital wealth assets that the country or the bioregion has. And the government then can use more traditional financial instruments to bring liquidity to its conservation action, such as a treasury bill or a nature-based treasury bill. Use the capital from that security to fund the conservation actions, and then link it to the assets that sit, let's say, on a new national nature reserve, treasury reserve, and introduce a new type of financial instrument, such as a digital currency. And it could use the frameworks of central bank digital currencies that are being designed and tested as a mechanism to repay investors. So we put this straw man idea out there, and we got a lot of traction and interest because central banks now have environmental accounts. And that's taken us to a path of research that we're not going to go over today, but is around the design of nature-based currency and how natural capital assets can be used in the process. With that, I think we've covered the design and why these are interesting and how it can power new mechanisms and markets. It's not up to us to fully say, here's the only market. It's more to think about the architecture and the framework that it empowers others. With that, over to one of my colleagues to dive into the units and methodologies. Maybe that is Matt. Or Endo. Or Luisa.
Yeah, I think the first part of this is building the marine biodiversity credit, and Maureen is going to tell us about the progress in that part of the project. Go for it, Mal.
Yeah, thank you. And in this part, we are walking you through our current research and thinking about the marine biodiversity credit and methodology for biodiversity. So the main question is how we can measure marine biodiversity in the Cocos Marine Conservation Area in Costa Rica. And how Martin said, one of the main proposals for us is measure the outcomes from conservation actions. So the problem we are trying to solve is it is difficult to evaluate the outcomes and effectiveness of marine conservation efforts because there are different metrics to be considered. And for example, biodiversity, oceans conditions, and ecosystem health. Also, there are different local needs. The data is limited, and measuring biodiversity directly is a complex process. So how measure marine biodiversity, right, is a big question. So we need a unit. So for this, and we propose a marine biodiversity unit, and this work in this moment is in a discovery phase. So we strive to create a metric that will include the ecological values of the ecosystems within an accurate or 1 kilometer square of ocean protected. The goal is quantify marine conservation efforts and create a unit to evaluate on a global scale. The process is combine the relevant data sets and methodologies that will be used to create a weighted unit based on biodiversity importance and a dynamic baseline that can then be used in a crediting system. But first, I want to introduce our POC. And so we are working in the Cocos Marine Conservation Area in Costa Rica. This marine protection area was expanded 27 times this previous site 2 years ago. And why Coco? Why this place is so important? So Cocos Island is an essential habitat for many marine species. 47% of these species are endemic. This is recognized worldwide as a biodiversity reservoir, and it constitutes one of the most privileged natural sites otherwise as well. Now, in the biodiversity measurement, and here we have a map from the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology layers. So here we can see different layers or information about the habitats in Cocos. So many layers of biodiversity information within different scenario classes provide aggregate insights to measure biodiversity. So the idea is combine of this information to have an indirect measure of biodiversity. And we have two different approaches. The first one is, okay, we can work with a base unit, and this base unit is equal to adjust square kilometers. And so this means that we have a weighted square kilometers considering different modulating factors. So these modulating factors can be like layers or information about habitats, normalized biodiversity square per each square kilometer, endemism, vulnerability, and others. So if we combine all these modulating factors, we can have a final number of units per square kilometer. And okay, if we want to consider all these modulating factors, how we can measure, how we can have information about them. So we here have different marine biodiversity metrics like wedge, star channel diversity index, ocean health index, etc. So the idea for us is create this spider matrix and evaluate each metric or index in base of accessibility or data available, the accuracy of, or if these metrics can be applied in our site place. So here we have this list, and we are open to explore more indexes and improve this list. Also, in the environmental field, we are consider other measurable indicators like bathymetry, surface currents, habitat diversity, sea surface temperature, water salinity. So in this example, you can see a map with a habitat diversity in the Cocos Marine Conservation Area, and other map with the coral reefs in Cocos too. And finally, other considerations that we have in mind is the scope. So combine local and global nexus and social goals and nested targets. Also the genetic analysis like environmental DNA information and phylogenetic health. So combining all these layers, we can build in the unit. And now Ando can explain us the other approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. So as Maureen was pointing out, this is an exploratory phase. So we're looking at different ways of possibly creating this unit. And it's not clear that there is a right way or a wrong way to do things. So another way to look at this is what we want to do in this approach is to provide incentives to maintain homeostasis. Now, this will work for areas that have protected and conserved their biodiversity over a certain period of time before a project can start. And thereafter, what we do is we start measuring, through the collection of some of these metrics, what the health of that ecosystem is doing, and whether it remains within some boundary of the original baseline. And if that remains true over the project period, then credits can be issued and claimed, therefore, for remaining within that baseline. And in order to do this, what we're seeing in the Cocos Island National Park and the greater ACMC is that there are a lot of very specific local biodiversity metrics that already exist that the Costa Rican government has rigorously evaluated over a long time. And there are also global and regional biodiversity matrices that are relevant in this context, and we see the need to be able to combine them holistically. And what we're sort of trying to do here is that we look at these, larger global metrics that can scale across the world, and there is a certain amount of data to be able to do that, such as endemism or weighted endemism, vulnerability from, for example, the IUCN Red List, planktonic health, which is again can scale across the oceans, and then be able to combine these with some sort of a local biodiversity score. So things that the local stakeholders deem to be important. And this combination allows us to give a sort of a unit, a score per unit area. In this case, in this example, in this toy example, it's 1 square kilometers. So like I was mentioning, the global indices are a combination of things like the IUCN Red List, Wedge, etc. The regional ones, which are more at the sort of country or at the subcontinent level, are things like NDCs, so nationally determined contributions. They can be national inventories of ecosystems such as forests, grasslands, mangroves. And then there are the local specific protection protocols, which are, for example, in Cocos, we have they are the breeding grounds of hammerhead sharks, and there are wildlife corridors that need to be protected for the hammerhead sharks to do their migrations through Cocos Island and to Galapagos. And so those are very specific, localized protection protocols that need to be incorporated within the larger scope of the health measurement. And so how some of this would work is that in this proposal, as opposed to the previous proposal where we're assigning a different score to every unit, here we kind of do the same thing. We start and we assign a different score to each of these units. But instead of creating a unit directly from that score, here what we do is we measure what's happening at a discrete points in time. So when the project starts, in this example, it's T0, a particular square unit had a score. And let's say in this example, it was 40%. The next year, we use the same protocols and we measure what that score is. And if it remains within plus or minus of the baseline, in this example, the limits of the baseline are 5%. So if it remains within that plus minus 5 or 40%, then a credit is issued. And this goes on year to year. So on years that you miss that baseline adjustment, no credits are issued. And so what this is doing is that you are rewarding homeostasis. So on an outcome-based metric. So instead of penalizing areas that naturally have either lower levels of biodiversity or harder to measure areas of biodiversity, for example, the deep ocean, instead of penalizing them, we're essentially ethically saying that all parts of the ecosystem are equally valuable, and what matters is that they remain within some limits of their natural health systems. The next slide, please. And so there are some complications with this, and part of it is that when you have large areas, for example, our project area in Costa Rica, you have to sort of divide them into what we're calling conservation scenarios, because there may be very different habitats within these conservation scenarios that there are local protocols have been created for. And so in this case, in the story example, we've broken this area up into 5 different zones. And there are different priorities that need to be harmonized within those zones. And then all of this sort of trickles up to a global score for that entire area. So like in the example before, there's an ecological corridor where shark tracking becomes relevant. In other areas, perhaps you need to monitor overfishing, and even in others, in, for example, coral reefs, you need very specific metrics of biodiversity that are related to the endemism of that coral reef versus invasive species in that coral reef. And so the way we're sort of imagining this is that all of this data flows up into a biodiversity model for that entire area, where sort of global observation sets, for example, Earth observation sets from satellites, ocean observation sets from ocean measurements and buoys, And for example, environmental DNA data, all of this sort of trickles into our sort of machine learning based aggregating model, which is essentially doing a interpolation between all the measurements that are taken across these zones. And from there, the credits are being assigned. This is a very sort of general model that can work in many of these scenarios. I'd like to hand this back off to Martin to introduce our wonderful team.
Thank you, Ando. You've seen we went into a very deep dive into the design of these methodologies. This is possible thanks to a great team that actually involves a whole bunch of other collaborators here. And so I want to flag a bit of how that biodiversity team has been focusing on, and of course, as we're looking at different approaches, we also see the need to work with more collaborators. I think, Luisa, you are going to walk us through a bit of how to get involved into the process. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. So we definitely see some of our collaborators like Regen Network on the call today. So shout out to you all and thanks for joining us. This first QR code, and I'm also just dropping the link in the chat, is a type form for how to remain involved with our oceans program as it continues to evolve. We are trying to decide the best way to organize key stakeholders, and getting your opinion on this survey would be really useful in order to do that. We also have a GitHub for people to share, for us to share the open source information, code, and data associated with the program thus far. And I'll also drop that link into the chat, and that's being maintained and it's totally open for anybody to check out and contribute to. So we are looking for stakeholders to help build our open source community, also who are familiar with different metrics and indices or other fractals, because this project in Cocos is local and we want to scale it global. So if you are aware of other projects happening in this same type of arena, we'd love to connect and understand the differences and potential collaborations there. So do put your information in so we can stay connected. And I see there is a question in the Q&A, which is, what do you see the most useful source of data that you are currently missing, if any? I'll give it a stab, and then I'm happy for Mao and Ando to jump in as well. I think for us, there is a lot of, there's a lack of just biodiversity ocean information in general. And when we're building these credits and the marine biodiversity unit, it's really key that we have the most, appropriate and available data, really that landscape really well figured out. So I don't know if there's a single piece of data from my perspective, but rather just to be sure that we're including all the data that is appropriate and available that's out there. But Mao, Ando, if either of you want to add to that, please do.
It's a great question because it also limits the methodologies often. Ando, go for it.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. It's something we grapple with every day. There is so much missing data for the oceans that it's hard where to start. And I think one of the key things that we're looking at when we look specifically for biodiversity metrics is like, what is the species distribution in different areas? Like what species and genuses are living in different parts of the ocean. And one of the ways that is possibly going to be revolutionary in this field is looking at environmental DNA and metagenomic analysis to understand, at least locally, what is happening within species distributions. And also we're looking at working with other organizations that are working on planktonic health, which sort of provide this like umbrella picture of how the ecosystem is doing through the net primary producers of that ecosystem.
I think Jay from New Atlantis is also online. They've been doing a lot of work on that and actively collaborating with us. But we need a village to make this work. Mao, anything on your end, also on data, and then also open to questions from everyone that's still around. First, thank you for joining. This is the next part is really to ask all kinds of questions that popped up and inspired from the conversation. As your questions are trickling in, we're in a bit of a sort of a crossroad in the biodiversity credit design, and we're compiling a status page where we describe what we've done, what are the pain points, what are the bottlenecks, where we need more input, and we were going to publish that so that collaborators out there that can help fill the gap or that they're grappling with similar issues, we can connect it and work together. So it would be great to get a shout out if you want to participate in that, as we see that naturally this is not our role as a relatively small nonprofit organization to try to address the biodiversity methodologies and credits for the entire world. And that's, for the most part, the nature of our environmental challenges require that we focus on them together. So also let us know your level of interest and what you work on and how you can plug in. Is there a specific email we can provide for participants that want to reach out or connect? I think that would be specifically useful. Obviously, you can reach out in info@openearth.org, but stay in touch is definitely a great way to do that. And here's the QR code for the GitHub.